Hi, good morning, everybody. On behalf of the Research Synergy Forum, I would like to welcome you all to today's talk by Professor Gregory Scholes. He's a William S. Todd Professor of Chemistry from the Princeton University, United States. And his research group, as you may have already heard yesterday, explores how complex molecular systems in chemistry and biology interact with light, probing some of the fundamental mechanisms in natural and artificial systems. Today, Professor Scholes, who also serves as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Physical Chemistry, brings you a masterclass on the do's and don'ts of scientific writing. Drawing from his extensive experience as both a leading researcher and a journal editor, he is going to share some practical insights on what goes into constructing a successful publication. So over to you.
Okay, yes, can everybody, this is probably better that you can hear me. So, what I'm going to do is first give a little introduction to things about Journal of Physical Chemistry letters, and then talk a bit about what makes a successful paper, what we know. But then most of the discussion that we can have is because Arat asked the question, what makes a paper great, which is a classic Arat question, and I realize that, this is, we'll talk a bit about what makes a great paper, which of course most of us will never write, but we may aspire to. So there's the two parts, and that will, help feed back into the more practical world of a successful paper, hopefully. So briefly, a couple of things about the Journal of Physical Chemistry letters, which may give some insight too into, how people, editors and the managing editors think about journals in general, especially at the ACS, but probably also at the RSC and other agencies. So, you're looking at having impact factor, optimal for the field. Physical chemistry, impact factor is obviously going to be less than, say, energy science. But our impact factor is high for a specialist physical chemistry journal. And we've thought about, how to publish modern topics. So the papers that are most interesting to the readers of the journal and ones we want to publish are more at the forefront of physical chemistry, modern techniques and ideas and theories and so on, and problems that are of current interest. And what we've worked especially hard on is to enhance the reputation of the journal. With the example I've always used in advocating for this over trying to play tricks to increase the impact factor, because, as you probably know, we could easily double the impact factor. All we do is reject all the physical chemistry papers and just publish, some papers on solar energy conversion. That wouldn't be very helpful. So the example I always use is physical review letters. I don't think there'd be any physicist who would care what the impact factor is. The point is, in many departments, if you don't publish in PRL, you won't get tenure, right? And that's the sign of a journal that's important for the field, because it's serious and the important papers are published there. Probably JAX is like that for chemistry. And we would like JPhysChem letters to be like that for physical chemistry, and I think it's fair to say it is. And since its inception, it's always had this focus on papers being screened, if you like, to make sure that they're urgent and significant, and that's just to do with the scope and improving the reputation and helping enhance all the papers that are published there. So, this is a benefit for the authors, and that helps the rapid publication. So everybody likes how quick it is, how quickly you get the paper appearing in press after it's accepted, which can be 24 hours. And then, again, as part of the process here, I can tell you is that we have, in addition to the editor-in-chief, there's executive editors that are the first people to see the papers, and they'll make an initial screening of the papers. And if they think something is not well suited to the journal, then I'll see the paper next and have a second look at it to double check. Otherwise it goes to one of the editors who will handle it in the usual way that you're all familiar with. So we've tried to do this to make everything as fair as possible. And I know many of you have published in the journal, and hopefully you've seen that, unlike the reputation of some journals where you get one bad review and, you know, the axe comes down and your paper is rejected, we try to give the authors a chance unless there's a particular reason why, you know, there's a problem scientifically and the work needs to be rethought, let's say. So, and then just highlighting the journal sections here, you know, there's always discussion on what the titles of these sections should be, and maybe most authors don't even look at the title sections, I'm not sure, but the managing editors at ACS love this. But we changed from the old-fashioned ones we have to ones that are, they're more interdisciplinary. You notice there's not experiment and theory, so everything goes together, which is the modern way, I think, in physical chemistry. So, getting to the topic that we want to talk about, though, first of all, this is a slide from JPhys Chem Letters, and then we'll see what I wrote in the next slide. So, some advice here is, and I'll put some of this in my own words as I read what Kate wrote here. You do need, I think the thing to keep in mind here with your paper is that most, and let's say it's published, but the same could apply to when an editor or reviewer looks at it. Firstly, most people will only read the title. And then they're going to decide, oh, should I print this paper or read it on my iPad or whatever you do. And if they think that they might want to look at it, the next thing they're probably going to look at is the abstract. Okay, and so, and bearing in mind, if you look at average citations of papers, there's probably only you and two other people that will read your paper. You know, if you could get one more reader who'll cite it, you know, that's a significant increase. And that's, you know, that's, in fact, if I could get one more citation for every paper published in JPhys Chem Letters, you know, the impact factor would go up significantly. But this, you know, when you think about it, this comes down to the title and the abstract. So, and you want, and sometimes the first paragraph of the paper. Okay, so simple title is what Kate says, which is right. It should be easy to understand what the finding of the paper is from the title. And if you want inspiration, go read some papers in biology, because biologists are so good at writing a title that says, you know, this gene controls this or whatever, and you can say, oh, I didn't even need to read the paper and I've already got the answer here. And the abstract should be similar, so it should, a good way, and we recommend this in the instructions for authors, if you look on if you could Google it or go through the Nature website, when you look at instructions for authors writing the bold paragraph for a paper to Nature, this is a really good instruction to follow for any paper. So it says, for instance, you want to say, well, here's what the field is thinking about the topic of this paper. Here's the question or whatever it is that your paper will work towards addressing, and here's the specific result of the paper. You know, and for a typical paper, it's not going to, don't claim that you've changed the world here. You want to just say this is what the specific finding of the paper is, because that's what people want to know, and that will give you increase the value of your paper over you saying that this was a first step to, you know, a 400% efficiency solar cell or something. Okay, so this being specific is really important. And Kate makes a good point here. Support your claims. So remember, then what the paper is about is saying, you know, this is what we found, and here's the breakdown of the evidence. So you walk your reader through, and always coming back to this main finding if you can. And nice looking figures really do make a difference, because it makes, even subliminally gives the reader the sense that this is really professional work. So take some time to make the good figures. And I think this second part that she put here, as everybody knows this at this point, is, my experience is, suggesting good experts as reviewers, not just picking, when I was an editor for Journal of Physical Chemistry, the most suggested reviewer was Michael Gretzel. But this is, and he would be a great reviewer if he reviewed your paper on TiO2 solar cells, but this is not going to help you because he'll never agree to review 1,000 papers a day, right? So you should put, can be really helpful to put assistant professors, who are less well known but expert in the field. They also tend to give the best reviews, most helpful, by the way. So yeah, think along those lines, and about responding to the reviews, the comments in detail. So and sometimes there'll be comments that you think, well, this person doesn't know what they're talking about. But think about that differently. What it means is you didn't explain in the paper clearly enough that point, and so all you need to do is add a few sentences to explain. Okay, there's no point arguing with the reviewer. Nobody's going to see this, and it won't improve your paper. You just, clarify things in your paper. The reviewer's not out to destroy your paper. They're just trying to, they're like, oh my goodness, I've got to, read all of this and try to understand it and, suggest some comments. Okay, so they'll appreciate good feedback. But so 3 more slides then before we get into the discussion on these case studies, and of course I can get your questions before we do that as well about the journal, but here's the summary. Succinct title, we said, an engaging introduction describes the specific advance of your work and how it fits into the field, because you want to say, what we discover in this paper is the following, and then you want to be able to say, well, people might care about this because it answers, some questions that have been raised in these other papers, or whatever it is. And the research should be comprehensive, and going deep into the subject this is now getting towards what makes a great paper. Okay, just, dashing off a bunch of results and so on is one thing, but to make the paper great, you're really going into detail of the analysis and the discussion, theory that supports experiment and vice versa. And finally, that I would say we could probably end the discussion after this next slide, if you like. But if you want a quantitative example of what makes a great paper, I'm going to show you. I dug out two papers. This is from when I was an assistant professor even, but I don't have many from, like 2 weeks ago I could have shown. But so here's 2 pages from 2 different papers, and this is what makes a great paper. I've read it. Look at all these writings on it. I checked some equations. I've underlined things. I've been using, what was published in these 2 papers, right? Rather than me just saying, oh, yeah, okay, but this sounds relevant and it's published in Nature, so I should cite it in my introduction without reading it. So, I think this is what you want to aspire for. These just things to do with nanoscience. It doesn't mean that you have to have a bunch of equations in the paper, but the point is the reader has obviously studied each of these for many hours and thought about them and used the results. So if there's any questions and discussion, we could do that now, and then I have these 4 case studies, or you can ask as we go along through the case studies, whatever you want.
So do folks have any questions at this point?
Yeah, there's a question over.
Can you raise your hand? I can't see. Oh, there
Can
you
you
are.
please explain this, what you just said? I did not get that part. These related equations.
No, what the point is that I actually read the papers. So already, remember what I said. That's that's elevated this paper above the majority, because somebody's read the paper and not just looked at it. There's a difference between knowing about a paper and reading it carefully. And there was enough new and relevant information advances in the paper that it helped my research. It influenced my research.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions so far? Go ahead.
Can you tell, when we are reading a new paper, how we should approach it? Like what part we should start? That would also really help.
So it's a good. Yeah. So I think. What you want to do is you need to work out what the paper is about. And and this is assuming then that you decide that the paper is relevant to your research and, interesting enough that you want to read it. Because there's so many papers these days, you can't read everything. So, then you want to really understand what was the finding of the paper, and that's going to be looking at carefully reading the introduction and the conclusion. And then you need to decide what you want to get out of the paper, and that would be then getting into the details. So if this is because you want to use the methods that they have used, you'd be really understanding what they did and how they used those experiments or theories. So you sort of, you don't necessarily just read the paper if it's a typical, complex paper in JPhys Chem or something, because it's going to be 10 or 15 pages long. So you approach it with, well, what am I going to use the paper for, after you understand what they've found.
Go ahead.
Sir, I have a question that, as he has asked that how we should read a paper, but my question is how we should write a paper, what should be the recipe? Because when we read a paper, we clearly find the difference between the abstract, the introduction part, the conclusion and all those things. But while writing, we see everything is same. What should be the difference between the abstract and the conclusion? That's the most practical and most difficult thing. We generally, the new researchers, we feel difficulty in writing the first paper.
Yeah. So usually to write a paper, you would you would make the figures first, and then you could present the figures to your group in a presentation, and if you could write down everything that you say in that presentation, then there's the results and discussion done. So that's how you want to think about it, because the paper is explaining your results to somebody. Okay, so if you have these figures and you get up and give the group meeting to explain it, and you're like, nobody understands what you're talking about, then you probably need to go, and that will tell you, so I shouldn't write the paper that way. You know, and oftentimes if you explain it, you'll tell it what you did more clearly than if you just sat down to write it. Yeah, so that would be the first part, and then it is a good question. So oftentimes you finish the paper and you're exhausted and you just want it done, and you're like, oh, I have to write this abstract, and so I'll just take the conclusion and copy it up there and put it in the present tense. But, you know, as we said before, it's going to, most people won't read more than the abstract. So you really should spend some time with it. And I would say the conclusions will be a bit more specific, because they'll have, presumably the reader will have read them after the paper, and there'll be a bit more detailed explanation of the finding. But the abstract will be, why did I do any of this in the first place? Which is why somebody might care to read it, and what field it's relevant to, and then what did I find from my research, and then sometimes some other sentence or two of what this might lead to in the future. So it's different than the conclusion, and in the abstract you would focus on the crucial main result. In the conclusion you could give more detail.
What from your experience do you suggest, that we should write the abstract in the beginning or at the last?
I think at the last, you can write it in the beginning as a placeholder, but you'll probably have to change it, because as you write the paper, you change your mind over what's the important finding. But yeah, I mean, sometimes I write the whole paper completely new, like 3 times anyway, so it doesn't, it shouldn't be a big deal to write the abstract 10 times.
Any other questions? So far, Shajesh has a question.
Yeah, it's regarding your suggestion on reviewers, choosing reviewers. So, what if a certain reviewer has certain... Okay, this is the darker side of the process, right? If they deliberately don't want your paper published, and I don't think it happened, maybe, I don't know, maybe not that relevant in case of JPC letters, but other journals, and particularly certain areas, as you can say. So, what do the editorial board, or as an editor, how do you see this? Like, do you identify, okay, there's no, the whatever objections by the reviewer, it has some other intentions? So do you work on such gut feelings, or you're tied to just take decisions based on the pure comments?
So yeah, the editor will look at the content of the review. So just because a review is negative doesn't mean it carries a huge amount of weight. Like if it's a negative review but is not either raising specific scientific issues or explaining why it doesn't think the paper should be published, yeah, then it doesn't carry any weight actually.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And very recently, we have seen this use of ChatGPT and other AI tools to generate reviews, and with specific prompts, as though, I mean, it's sort of clear to us it's not written by an expert, but how do we communicate in our response? Is it a good idea to, as a separate comment to the editor, this is the AI check we have done, and in one case it was showing the AI tool was detecting it to be 100% AI generated. So it's a tricky situation. So
I think you could raise it. This is a question that all the publishers are asking now. How can we deal with that because, yeah, so speaking to your point, you can, what I've heard is that you can put into, the paper into Chat GPT and say, write a negative review of this paper, or write a positive review, whatever you think.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And yeah, we're all worried about this, in addition to AI writing papers in these paper mills, which is, becoming quite unbelievable, and journals are trying to detect these papers too, which typically, of course, steal things from legitimate published work from all of us.
Any other questions?
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's a good question.
Go ahead. Divya Jyoti.
I have a related questions. How much we can use AI generated text in papers? Is there any guideline for that? Because as you know, as you mentioned, it is coming up, and I think many are advocating for it that we should use to some extent. But what is the extent?
I think it's agreed that using AI to improve the English of the paper, so like as a supersonic grammar checker, is a good thing because it makes the paper readable. But of course, it's on the author to check that it doesn't start making up stuff. And certainly you wouldn't want to use it to write the paper and include references, because it just completely makes up the references. Even when you're legitimately asking to do a kind of literature search by it, as I've discovered, it gives no real papers. But I think using it to improve the English is a really great idea. It helps the reviewer and the reader, and it helps the paper. Using it to ask questions like, checking, is there a theorem that says, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it knows, all of this stuff. It's amazing. But yeah, what you can't do is use it to do your research for you.
Any other questions so far? Okay, then I guess we can.
There is one at the.
Oh, there is one. Sorry, go ahead.
More than one way to the field, and generally there's this advice that you should stick to one big idea in a paper, but here you also show that paper should be dense in terms of content. How do we decide should we split it or combine things as an editor? What do you think?
Whether you have one big paper or two smaller ones. Yeah, so one guiding principle, is this on? One guiding principle is that, the fewer papers that you can write, the better, so that they're comprehensive, so that it's, people who get a reputation for splitting things up into little pieces, are not highly respected. But on the other hand, if you have this paper where it turns out I'll give you an example from my postdoc from just a few weeks ago. It gives me this manuscript, which was, I think it would have been 60 journal pages in physical review. So I first saw that and thought, oh my goodness, who's going to have to review this? But what we realized is that the paper was really about developing some method of analysis, and then she had these examples, and which were really interesting on their own, but they were and would be read by different readers than the more technical side, and so we took them out and we'll publish them separately because they're to do with energy transfer and, for instance, and bird navigation, whereas all of this other stuff was giving the tool that would allow the analysis, and it could stand alone. So yeah, you don't. Yeah, if one important result is going to be hidden because it's included in the bigger paper, then I think it can be a good idea to separate it.
Any more questions? Oh, there's one there. Okay.
So sir, like if we develop a strategy, it might be there be some cases where the strategy might fail, a methodology where the methodology would not work. So how do we report these shortcomings or the corner cases for the development?
Yeah, right. So you do need to not hide, not claim something works, for everything if you know that it doesn't. So I think it's fine to say that the method works for some set of systems or some set of parameters, but outside this range there's cases where it doesn't work, and say for example so I think that would help the paper.
So does that impact the acceptance, like will the paper be accepted or not be accepted?
No, as long as the paper doesn't claim to solve all problems, but then in the paper you say it only solves some. Yeah, as long as it's clear from the outset, this should have no effect. Yeah.
Any more questions? You can just raise your hand if you have any.
There'll be more time for questions anyway.
Yeah, sure. So we can move on to the case studies perhaps. Great.
Yeah, so this is at the Arat level. It is good to think about, and one of the reasons is that in your research, the papers that stand out that you write will be ones where where the paper addresses a really key question. Okay. Typically, or it can be a new discovery, but that takes some luck. You can't really plan for that so much. But often it's something you've been working towards for a number of years, and you've said, well, this is the question we need to answer, and then finally you do some experiments or whatever, and they answer it, like this paper. So one thing to point out is you don't need to publish in Nature to get the Nobel Prize. So this is what Munji won the Nobel Prize for, this paper, which is interesting because I've used it in teaching undergraduate classes and graduate classes as an example for years, because this is not a two-page paper that quickly gives some results and then says how wonderful they are. It's many pages long, and they go into so much detail here. This is just a snapshot of part of it, but spectroscopy of many different samples to compare the size dependence of the nanocrystals. Really, for the time, it was state-of-the-art TEM, high resolution, as well as showing the monodispersity of the samples, powder X-ray diffraction, all these other characteristics that served as the benchmark for papers that followed it. So you were going to publish a synthesis of nanocrystals, you had to do all of these things that they did in this paper. So there was a huge amount of work. It was very thorough. This is what I mean by the paper being so thorough. But what made it a great paper, because anybody could probably do this nowadays for some new nanocrystal, and you won't get the Nobel Prize. What made this a great paper was that before this paper was published, there was a lot of papers on colloidal nanocrystals looking for quantum confinement that had been predicted. Mostly people were looking at cadmium sulfide, and the reason was that's what's in the shot glass filters, and that's what the physicists had identified for the size effects initially. But you couldn't get good size control. The colloids were terrible, in other words. The TM pictures looked, appalling. And lacked the ability to control the surface. So the spectroscopy was bad. So the photoluminescence always showed trap emission. You couldn't get these incisive results that now you see in undergraduate textbooks from this. So what was lacking then was the ability to synthesize controllable size nanocrystals where you could say this is the average size and the variance is small, and here's the optical properties. And this is what Monchi's paper reported, and apparently I saw him give a lecture after he won the Nobel Prize, and he said he'd been thinking about this since he was a postdoc, and then it was his job proposal. This is like the ideal scenario for a university, is that somebody wins the Nobel Prize for what they did as an assistant professor. And the breakthrough was this trialkyl oxide capping of the nanocrystals, right, which was the game changer, which he'd thought a bit about, and through discussion with other people. So this is an authoritative paper, and it's a step change. You went from a lot of work from Horst Welle, which was beautiful, but never cracked the problem, because of this. The spectroscopy and the size distributions were terrible, and all of a sudden they were amazing. So, here's one case example of what makes a great paper. It's a step change in the field, and think about what happened because of this. I would say because of this one paper, because of how amazing the results were, nanoscience, and nanochemistry in particular was, exponentially grew after this. And it took a few years even, but nowadays think about all the nanocrystals people can make that are high quality, all the different materials because of this paper. So, yeah, when we have the great underlined, here's an example. Shall I go on to another example?
Yeah, please go ahead. Do we have any questions so far based on what? No, okay. I guess
we can have some discussion about this. This is so yeah, perhaps,
Einstein.
Yeah, it may be unfair to put this up, but you've probably, the New York Times knows about the question put forth in this paper. It's called the EPR paper.
Right.
Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen. And it's been cited over 20,000 times, but probably cited, it's one of those papers where it's cited without actually specifically citing it. So I'm sure it's mentioned hundreds of thousands of times in the literature. And why is that? Those of you who don't know what the paper's about, is that this essentially gave birth to the idea of entanglement. It's not mentioned in this paper, but Schrödinger used that term afterwards in trying to explain what was happening here. What concerned Einstein in particular here is that if you entangle two particles, two electrons or two photons, for example, and I'll give a modern explanation, I won't use the one that's in the paper, which was to do with position and momentum, but you entangle them, let's say, in a spin state and take them far apart, then either of these particles, let's say their spins that were initially in a singlet state, could be spin up or spin down, okay, like this. They're anti-correlated, and we know, you can easily show from the operators that they're anti-correlated, but either one could be either spin up or spin down, right? So it's the idea that if I measure particle A, that we now call Alice, she could be spin up or spin down, and when I do the measurement I find out, okay, spin up. Yet the particle over here, as I said, could be spin up or spin down, but after I've measured Alice and she's spin up, then particle B, which is called Bob, has to be spin down, because we can unequivocally show from the operators that you have to have that anti-correlation. So what Einstein said, there must be something missing from the theory of quantum mechanics, because I don't believe that there could be some, what he called spooky action at a distance, or in later letters, that said, Alice is spin up, so you better make sure you're spin down when you get measured. He said that doesn't make sense. So he said there must be something missing from the theory. And actually in the next example I'll talk to something about that. But so, you know, what made it a great paper is it opened this whole discussion. So it didn't solve the problem. Okay, so this is different than Munji's paper. It didn't solve the problem, but it identified the research question and said why this is a compelling question. It led to this concept of entanglement, and experiments, you know, demonstrated entanglement, of course, won another Nobel Prize. And this is 90 years after the paper was published, and it's still influencing people. So, yeah, it's not bad for a weekend's work. So if you can identify a question and explain, you know, why why you have this question, that's also good. And these days, often that might be something that would come in the outlook, maybe of a perspective article, you know, not on this grand scale of the EPR paper, but you could think of doing this on some scale in a perspective article, and that would influence people, you know, get your paper cited because you've said, well, it seems we did all of this great work, but there's this question that's bugging us and we don't understand the answer. So, yeah, sometimes if you don't understand something, it can be a good idea to tell other people and try to get influence to others. I can move on to, so this is on the EPR paper, pretty specific title. You may have heard of Bell's inequalities. So, and this is 30 years after Einstein's paper, right? And all in that time, people have been saying, well, what's missing from quantum mechanics? There must be some hidden variables in the wave functions that would make the correlations look classical. And they would be hidden, they're called hidden local variables because they'd have to be here in Alice and here specifically in Bob. Okay, to be, because the idea is they're separated, and so that then these hidden variables then decide the outcomes of the measurements. And what Bell did in a 3-page paper, I think it was, is gave some arguments as to why hidden local variables could not solve the problem, the question that Einstein put forward. So this is an extreme example, but I spoke to a science editor once who said they call this kind of paper a bullet paper because it ends a discussion on a field. It doesn't have to, and so this, I mean, and you need to be careful with that conclusion. Okay, that Bell's very specific with it, and you know excludes hidden local variables. But he, you know, introduced this step change in how we think about quantum correlations to start with. Now we can say if Bell's inequality is violated, then you have quantum correlations. You have a quantum advantage potentially. So he gave this dividing line between classical correlations and quantum. So forget about the EPR paper. This is the most influential outcome of this paper. You know, when you think about it, and he answered this question of the hidden variables definitively because it's a theorem. But you can see how he got people thinking differently, and then it was realized that this could be the test for, you know, quantum correlations now, and then people developed how to put that into an experiment, the CHSH method. And lastly, and maybe getting a bit back to Earth here from the stratosphere, I showed this slide yesterday from Graham Fleming's group. So this, both of these are great papers. The Engel paper, this picture on the right here, many of you will have seen it probably in other people's presentation. So I'll say a couple of things here. Sign of a great paper is when other people's talks that they give at conferences show a figure from your paper. And then you'd say, oh, my paper must be a great paper. Many people show this picture, including me, you see, of Graham's work here. But what... But this is an interesting case study. So this is a great paper, but it didn't... it turned out to be like, if you read the last few paragraphs of the paper, none of this is correct. We now know the interpretation. Okay, it's not electronic coherence that's long-lived. There's no application to Grover's algorithm in quantum computing in a biological system and so on. That, none of that matters. And think about what this paper led to, cited thousands of times too. It showed the power of this new experimental probe, 2D electronic spectroscopy, that a lot of people are now using. It inspired future developments in theory as well as experiment as people tried to work out what's happening here. At the time we could calculate energy transfer only in the limiting cases using Redfield theory and Förster theory. Because of this paper, people developed path integral methods, hierarchical equation of motion, and other accurate methods of quantum dynamics to solve not just energy transfer, but any dynamics in any parameter regime. And it was it was just a mysterious observation that was cool. That got people interested in it, and people studied it for 10 years before it was satisfactorily understood. And there's still some good open questions about it, but theory and experiment together, so it engaged the field. And I think that's a more realistic, great paper that we could aim for. So, they're the case studies, and it's open to your thoughts and discussion and questions.
Awesome. Thanks for the lovely talk, Greg. So I guess we'll just put our hands together and get questions based on this half of the talk. Kushal, you have one?
To understand how the journal judges these papers, which are purely based on thoughts or maybe research gaps. So do not have actual data, methodology, but maybe you were saying like in the last time, there is the possibility of a new phenomenon. So how do the journal judges that? Because at that time when this paper was published, it was not discussed that much. But now we discuss it because people try to work towards this direction.
Of the Fleming paper?
No, the Einstein paper.
Ah.
So if today someone publishes paper which is very new or presents the question in the current field, so how the journal judges that?
How does it?
How the journal judges that, like whether it will be a good paper or
Oh, how general. That you open a new question in the field?
something like that.
I think which is just a thought, right? So that's what.
Basically, based on thought experiments, so there should be something inconsistency.
Yeah, it would be harder these days, is I think what you're getting at. You would have to, but the... to make the compelling case, it would need to be very rigorous in the basis. So you couldn't just make a claim. The referees won't accept it. Like remember the referees are kind of nervous, right? If you are reviewing a paper that makes some, extraordinary claims, then you're going to be pretty nervous. Well, what if I say this all sounds good, and the other two referees point out all the flaws, and then I look like an idiot? So, referees are going to be cautious. So, but on the other hand, if it's based on rigorous, like theorem, like the Bell's paper, or analysis of correlations from experiment or something, where you could make the case, and that's what you would need these days.
Other questions?
Just a follow-up question of what he asked. Sorry. So, is there a scope for something like a perspective, particularly in journals like JPC Letters, where you see a gap based on some recent development within the field, but it's more of a new gap or new possibility that you sense, and by connecting the dots, if you propose something, would it be too premature or such? It may rather sound like an opinion piece, but does it have a place in journals like JPC Letter?
Well, there is a viewpoint article that can be used for that. We had thought about the Chinese researchers were keen on having a paper exactly what you say here, which is something too preliminary to publish, but it seems like an interesting idea, which would, I guess, enable you to get priority on it. But yeah, it is difficult because you can't just, you'd need support for what you're proposing. You can't just sort of make some claim that's not supported, and then on the off chance somebody discovers that, then you can say that you proposed it. But there are viewpoint articles where you can say, well, here's my, here, as you say, here's some observations, here's a possibility for an explanation. Yeah, so, or a perspective article where that would be the forward-looking conclusion, where you might have reviewed some of this work and shown some of your own results and then said, there seems to be some connection that would be, and this is why it would be interesting, and this is what we would need to look for. Yeah, that would be a very nice, like the fantastic way to end a perspective.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. So suppose once I have a paper ready to submit, would it be better to have a pre-submission inquiry to some journals or directly submit to one of them? What is a good way out? Because once I've submitted, I would expect maybe a month or two to get some response on it, whether it's a desk rejection or it goes into review. So if I want to quicken things for everybody, what is a good way out?
Well, I noticed recently on the Nature website that they say pre-submission inquiries are welcome, but basically they say, but we're not going to make any decision on research papers. So really, they'll do it for reviews only, because they're going to rely on more expert opinion. With ACS journals, you can get advice from the editor if the paper's maybe different than many of the other papers published, and then that can help, and especially if you see them at a conference or something. Also, I've heard with the Nature editors, they go around to different departments sometimes, and you can tell them about your paper, but I'm not sure that changes the geological timescale of the review process.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions so far? We do have time for at least 2 more questions. Feel free.
Or suggestions.
Yeah, I guess to address what Kushal was asking, you have one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like the paper from Einstein, like it's a like a problem statement or like a question. So does the reputation of the author depends on what you are publishing? You know, like sometimes a new like there is a new author, like just like we are a PhD scholars, and sometimes when there is a big name connected with our paper, it have different impact. Like does it in these type of paper, does it plays a role?
The fact that it's Einstein that wrote this?
Yeah.
Yes, but that's also because, remember, at the time he and Bohr disagreed about like what is measurement in quantum mechanics and other, you know, the other things. He had even though he had sort of initially identified the quantum theory, he had reservations about aspects of it. So it was not just this one paper. But yeah, so coming to your question, unfortunately, I think it's fair to say that, yeah, if you co-authored a paper like this yourself and you had a famous co-worker as a co-author, that would definitely help the paper.
So without a big name, like what are the chances for a new researcher to like get these kind of paper published?
It's difficult. So what it requires, and actually this is often my advice to assistant professors. You come into the job, you're all enthusiastic, got great ideas, you know, everything that you write, you know, this is a science paper. But really what you need to do is build the foundation for the science paper, and that can take, you know, what you want to focus on first is let's write some long, serious, deep papers that will go to JPhys Chem, JChem Phys, or wherever you like to publish, that will show that I'm an expert in this field and build towards your radical new idea. So it's the foundation that will matter, and then then you don't need to be a famous person. But if it comes out of nowhere, as I said, the referees are going to be nervous. Now, unless you're a mathematician and you're proving the Riemann hypothesis, where the proof is going to be checked, you know, there you can make that claim, right? And the proof will be checked, and if the proof is correct, all is good. They're not going to say, oh, surely this proof is going to be wrong. We'll reject the paper. But, you know, it's different in our field because, you know, if there's not like a proof of what you're claiming. But if it's supported by a body of work that you've done in the past, that's different.
Go ahead, please.
I have a question about the narrative of the paper that we are writing. So, for example, we have written a paper, whichever our findings is. So, does how we narrate our finding affect how great our paper is? For example, say there's a hint of red in the mic, right? So, I can say I like it because there's a hint of red in the mic. Or I can say I don't like it. I like it because there's no blue in the mic, right? So is there a specific narrative that we should follow? And if there is such specific narrative, which narrative should we follow?
I think sort of, probably precisely how you present the narrative shouldn't be the difference between a great paper and not a great paper, because it's more about you being able to say in a few sentences, you know, here's the open issue in the field, so which, you know, is going to be the case for a great paper, right? Here's the open question. This is why people are worried about it, and there's been, you know, let's say, thousands of papers trying to increase the diffusion length of excitons in organic materials, and then writes, you know, in this paper, we show experiments that show these amazing diffusion lengths, and so then it's clear, and then the narrative, then how you write then the results and the discussion that support it and the analysis. The specifics don't matter, except that they need to be show that it's a clear and compelling explanation, so that you have done all the experiments you need to do, you've done the controls. Yeah, that's what to think about.
So, in scientific studies, like as the what about in other studies such as social science or something? There is no difference.
So yeah, different fields have different ways of presenting the paper. So in social studies, so then I haven't read a lot of social studies papers, but I actually have read some. So I guess it's there the emphasis is on the statistics and the methods of the statistical analysis, if I'm not mistaken. And so, that's going to be the focus. Or in economics, I guess there's two kinds of papers, but they're often theorem-based as well, like mathematics, and then it's more clear.
We have time for another question. Just one moment. You have one?
So, what actually distinguishes between the weightage based on novelty or the methodology that improves, or the methodology that can be improved over the ages, or the novelty of the situation that the paper gives a novel solution at the point for this era? What distinguishes and what weightages both contains?
So, novel methodology versus new concept.
Yes.
So, and what's the question?
Novelty versus methodology, strength of methodology.
I see. So, methods paper versus just a new concept.
Yes.
So new methods papers don't tend to be cited very much. So we always send them to JFIS Chem A, and they have a section for that, which is interesting, isn't it? And so that tells you something. So, but that doesn't mean that new methods themselves can't have impact. But that's a different paper. So it's the paper where you have this new method that enables you to get insight into the system and answer a scientific question of interest. That's what will be cited. But just showing a new method, is because it's of interest only to the specialist. It won't be cited much, unless in the end. So the development of high resolution microscopy, STEM and STORM and so on. Once you can show what that can do, and then people start using it as well, and they go back and often will cite the original methods paper. So that that's a different one, I guess. To be fair, and maybe NMR was similar before I was alive.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess we can wrap up this session. Professor Scholes, we'd like to, so the Associate Dean, Professor Shilpi Sharma is here, and we'd like to felicitate you with a memento.